I was dying and I knew it. Not the kind of dying that sneaks up on you, the slow, dignified kind they make movies about, where people say meaningful things and light falls beautifully through hospital windows. This was organ failure. This was contaminated blood turning my own body into a battlefield I was losing. This was a countdown happening in real time while my doctors stood at the foot of my bed and chose their words very, very carefully. They didn't need to. I could read the monitors myself. The numbers weren't lying. I could have fallen apart. I could have screamed at the ceiling or bargained with God or called the one sister I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Instead, I lay very still in that hospital bed, watching rain streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I made myself think clearly. The serum exists. Someone owns it. Find out who. It took me 4 hours and 2 phone calls to get the answer. It took me 4 seconds to wish I hadn't asked. The doctor who told me looked like he regretted every word leaving his mouth. The antiviral compound was intercepted during a port seizure 6 weeks ago, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. It was an unauthorized shipment, not yet approved by the government. The man who seized it. He stopped. Cleared his throat. He doesn't release assets. Not for hospitals. Not for regulatory bodies. Not for anyone. Who is he? A pause long enough to mean something. Fabio De Luca. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. I watched the ripples move across the doctor's face, discomfort, resignation, something close to pity. I had heard that name before. Everyone in this city had. You heard it in the way people lowered their voices in certain conversations, in the way port workers crossed themselves after shipment inspection, in the way the news reported on his legitimate business empire without ever quite touching the edges of everything else. He doesn't negotiate fairly, the doctor added quietly. No, I said. But he negotiates. I signed myself out of hospital care the next morning. Not because I was better. Because lying in a monitored bed waiting for a cure that required his permission felt like the slowest possible way to lose. I was a shipping yard worker with a clean record and 11 days of functional organ capacity. I had nothing Fabio De Luca wanted. Which meant I had nothing left to protect. His headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a steel and glass tower in the financial district, the kind of building designed to make you feel small before you even walked through the doors. Security stopped me at the lobby. I told them my name. Told them I needed 5 minutes with their employer. The man behind the desk looked at me the way people look at things they're about to discard. Mr. De Luca doesn't take unscheduled meetings. Tell him I'm the woman dying from the toxin his port seizure made incurable, I said. Tell him I have cash. Tell him I'll wait. I waited 40 minutes. Then the elevator opened. His office was all dark glass and controlled silence. No clutter. No noise. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below like a painting he owned. He was standing when I walked in. Fabio De Luca. Black tailored suit. No tie. Dark eyes that swept across me once, not rudely, just efficiently, the way a man catalogs information he's decided is relevant, before settling on my face with a patience that felt almost insulting given the circumstances. He was younger than I expected. And far more composed. I laid my savings on his desk. $11,000 in a bank transfer confirmation. Everything I had. I need the antiviral serum, I said. The compound from the Vettori shipment. I know you have it. I know there are full doses. And I know that what I'm offering you is nothing compared to what you could sell it for. He didn't look at the transfer confirmation. He looked at me. Then why are you here? He asked. His voice was quieter than I expected. Controlled. Like everything else about him. Because I'll do anything, I said. Name it. The room held its breath. Fabio tilted his head slightly, not a reaction, just an adjustment, like something I'd said required a small recalibration. He moved from behind his desk. Slowly. The city stretched out behind him, rain-soaked and glittering, and I made myself hold his gaze even though every instinct I had told me to step back. He stopped 2 feet from me. Money, he said, is not a price. Then what is? He studied me for a long moment. Something moved behind his expression, not warmth, not cruelty. Something more deliberate than either. I'll move you to my private medical facility tonight, he said. My doctors. My equipment. Full monitoring. My breath loosened slightly. Until he continued. You'll receive the first dose this evening. He paused. The remaining treatment will be administered in stages. At my discretion. The looseness in my chest locked back up. What does stages mean? He held my gaze without any visible discomfort. It means I'll keep you alive, Fabio said calmly. The rest of the cure comes later. How much later? That, he said, depends entirely on you. I stared at him. The rain hammered the windows. Somewhere in the building below us, the city kept moving, oblivious, ordinary, free. Why? I asked. The word came out barely above a whisper. Why not just cure me tonight and name whatever you actually want? For the first time, something shifted behind his eyes. Just briefly. Just enough to make me more afraid than I'd been before. Because if I cure you completely tonight, Fabio De Luca said quietly, you'll leave. They transferred me to the penthouse suite within the hour. The suite was glass and steel and silence, more beautiful than any hospital room had a right to be, and far more dangerous. An four-line was placed in my arm by a doctor who didn't introduce himself. The first microdose administered. Just enough. I could feel the difference within 20 minutes, a faint steadying, like someone had turned down the volume on my own body's panic. Not a cure. A leash. I lay in the dark as the storm moved across the skyline and I understood, with perfect clarity, what I had agreed to. I didn't yet know what it would cost me. I didn't yet know what it would cost him. But I would find out. Because the following evening, Fabio De Luca came back. Not with doctors. Not with contracts. He came alone, and he adjusted my four-line himself. He came back the second night without announcement. No knock. No warning. Just the quiet click of the suite door and then his footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, crossing the room toward my bed like a man who had already decided this space belonged to him. I was awake. I had been awake for most of the night before too, watching the city through the glass wall, counting my own pulse, trying to determine the exact shape of the trap I had walked into. Fabio didn't speak immediately. He moved to the four-stand, checked the line, adjusted something at the junction point with the focused efficiency of a man who had done his research. Then he pulled the chair from the corner of the room, not the one already positioned beside my bed, but the one further back, the one that required intention to retrieve, and sat down. He looked at me. I looked at him. You fired the night nurse, I said. She was speaking too casually. She was doing her job. Her job, Fabio said, is to monitor your vitals. Not to discuss them with you in a way that causes your cortisol to spike at 2 in the morning. He paused. Your stress markers were elevated when I arrived. They've been elevated for 36 hours. I stared at him. You've been monitoring my stress markers. I've been monitoring everything. There was nothing threatening in his tone. That was the part that unsettled me most. He said it the way someone states weather, factual, impersonal, completely unbothered by how it landed. That's not normal, I said. No, Fabio agreed. It isn't. He didn't elaborate. He simply sat there in the low light of the suite, one ankle resting on his knee, completely at ease in a room that wasn't his, except that it was, because everything in this building was his, including apparently the chair he'd chosen and the air I was breathing and the measured drip of serum keeping my organs functional. I turned my face back toward the window. Why are you here? I asked. Actually here. Tonight. You have doctors for this. A long pause. I know, he said. He stayed another hour. He didn't explain himself further. When he left, I realized my pulse had steadied somewhere in the middle of his silence. I didn't know what to do with that. By the fourth night, I had identified the pattern. He came after 10. Always alone. He checked the 4 first, always the 4 first, before anything else, like it was a priority that outranked conversation. Then the chair. Then the quiet that he seemed entirely comfortable inhabiting while I was not. On the 4th night he brought a folder. Read through it in silence for 20 minutes while I watched him from the bed, trying to determine whether I was a patient to him or a project. You worked the Vettori yard for 4 years, he said, without looking up. 3.5. You filed 2 safety complaints in that time. Neither was actioned. I went still. You pulled my employment records. I pulled everything. He turned a page. The second complaint, contaminated runoff near the eastern dock storage, was filed 8 months ago. If it had been actioned, the exposure risk would have been contained. Something cold moved through me. Are you telling me this was preventable? He closed the folder. I'm telling you, he said carefully, that the people responsible for that yard's safety compliance had other priorities. What priorities? He looked at me then. And for just a moment, behind all that composure, I saw something that looked almost like calculation, the brief visible working of a decision about how much to say. Rest, he said instead. Your inflammation markers were down this morning. I want them lower by Friday. He left before I could push further. But the folder stayed on the table beside my bed. I read every page of it twice before morning. The psychological control, I realized by the end of the first week, was elegant precisely because it didn't feel like control. He never made demands. He never issued instructions directly to me, only to the staff, only about my care, always framed as medical optimization. But the effect was the same. My world had contracted to this suite, these windows, his nightly visits, and the slow metered drip of a cure he held at his complete discretion. He brought dinner on the 5th night. Had it set on the table by the window, proper table settings, actual food, nothing institutional about it. He sat across from me and ate and asked me questions about my work at the yard in the tone of a man genuinely curious rather than conducting an interview. What did I actually do there? Whether I'd chosen it or fallen into it. What I'd wanted before the yards. I answered more than I intended to. There was something about his quality of attention, the way he listened without filling silences, without redirecting toward himself, that made speaking feel safer than it should have. You're good at this, I said, near the end of the meal. At what? Making people comfortable enough to talk. He considered that. Most people find me the opposite. Most people aren't sitting across from you in a room you're paying for. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. Fair, he said quietly. On the 7th night, I called him manipulative. I had been building toward it for days, assembling the observation, testing its edges, waiting until I felt steady enough to say it without my voice betraying anything. He had just dismissed a second nurse. This one for hovering near my medication schedule without direct instruction. I watched her leave and then I looked at him and I said it plainly. You're manipulating me. Fabio set down the document he was reviewing. Yes, he said. No hesitation. No deflection. Just that single syllable, offered without apology or shame, like an answer to a question about the weather. I hadn't expected that. That's all you have to say? I'm not lying to you, he said. I told you the treatment would come in stages. I told you the terms were conditional. Everything I've done since you arrived has been exactly what I said it would be. He paused. Manipulation and deception aren't the same thing. They're close enough. No, he said. They're not. One involves hiding the truth. The other involves using it. His eyes held mine. I've never hidden anything from you, Carmela. It was the first time he'd used my name. The honesty shook me more than cruelty ever could have. Because I couldn't argue with it. And I hated that I couldn't argue with it. And somewhere underneath the anger was the far more troubling fact that I had begun to feel safer in this room, with this man, in this constructed careful trap, than I had felt anywhere in the weeks before my diagnosis. I turned toward the window so he wouldn't see me working through that. The discovery happened on the 9th night. Fabio had left earlier than usual, something about a meeting that couldn't wait, a brief apology in his tone that surprised me more than the early departure. The suite was quiet. The storm outside had softened to a low persistent rain. I got up. My legs were steadier than they'd been the week before. The serum was working, incrementally, measurably, the way he'd said it would. I moved to the small adjoining study he sometimes used when his work ran late. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. Evidence of something. The shape of his real agenda in physical form. What I found was a shipping manifest dated 10 weeks ago. The Vettori Yard. Eastern Dock. The same contaminated shipment that had poisoned me. My eyes moved down the document. Routing details. Origin port. Intended destination. And then a name, circled in ink, at the top of the receiving column. F. De Luca. I read it 3 times. The shipment hadn't been random. It hadn't been an accident of proximity or bad luck or a safety complaint gone unactioned. The contaminated cargo had been routed through the Vettori yard specifically, a yard that operated in territory adjacent to Fabio's ports, as a deliberate act of sabotage. Against him. I was never the target. I was collateral damage in someone else's war. And Fabio De Luca had known that from the moment I walked into his office. He had known exactly who I was. He had known exactly what had happened to me and why. He had known, and instead of stepping away, instead of flagging me as a complication and sending me back to a public hospital to die quietly, he had inserted himself deeper. I sat down slowly in the chair behind his desk. The manifest shook slightly in my hands. He doesn't feel guilty, something told me. That's not what this is. The thought arrived fully formed, cold and clarifying. He felt something else entirely. And I was sitting in the center of it, connected to his 4-line, kept alive by his measured decisions, slowly becoming something I didn't have a word for yet. Not a hostage, not a patient, not a transaction. Something more permanent than any of those things. The door of the suite clicked open behind me. Fabio's footsteps stopped when he reached the study doorway. I looked up from the manifest. We looked at each other across the quiet room. You knew, I said. He didn't deny it. He didn't move. He just stood in the doorway with that same unreadable composure, and for the first time since I'd arrived in his world, I saw something underneath it that looked, just briefly, like a man bracing for the consequence of a choice he had made a long time ago. Sit down, Carmela, he said quietly. Tell me the truth. A long silence. Sit down, he said again. And I will. He sat down across from me. Not behind the desk, beside it, in the secondary chair, positioned at an angle that felt less like authority and more like intention. Like he had decided, somewhere between the doorway and this moment, that what came next required a different posture than the one he usually occupied. The manifest was still in my hands. He looked at it once. Didn't ask me to put it down. The Vettori yard sits on the boundary of 2 territorial claims, he began. His voice was even. Measured. The voice of a man who had organized this explanation before, not for me specifically, but because he had known, eventually, someone would require it. The Eastern Dock has been disputed for 18 months. A rival family, the Caruso network, has been running interference on my port operations. Slowing shipments. Corrupting inspections. Small moves. The kind designed to accumulate rather than confront. And the contaminated cargo? I asked. Was theirs? He paused. Routed through the Vettori yard specifically because they knew my men would eventually seize it during a routine inspection. The toxin was embedded in the secondary packaging of a legitimate shipment, designed to be released during handling. His jaw tightened fractionally. It was meant for my men. The dock workers on that shift were incidental. I was incidental. Yes. The word landed plainly. No softening around it. I appreciated that, even as it cut. And you knew this before I walked into your office. I knew it within 48 hours of your diagnosis, he said. My people monitor the yards. When the contamination reports came through and the exposure list was identified, he stopped. Something moved behind his expression. Your name was on it. And you decided to what? Keep me close out of guilt. No. Then what? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, thinking. Choosing the precise words with the same deliberateness he applied to everything. I don't feel guilty, Fabio said. Guilt implies I caused it. I didn't cause it. He met my eyes. But I feel responsible for it. Those are different things. They don't feel different from where I'm sitting. I know. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, and for a moment the composed authority he wore like a second skin shifted just enough to show the man underneath it. Not vulnerable. Fabio De Luca didn't do vulnerable, I was already certain of that, but present. Actually present, in a way that was harder to deflect than anger would have been. You were harmed because of proximity to my world. A world you never chose. That makes your survival, he paused again. Mine to ensure. I stared at him. You're telling me this is obligation. I'm telling you, he said carefully, that it started that way. The suite was very quiet. Rain moved against the glass in slow diagonals. The 4-line in my arm carried its measured promise of continued existence, and I sat across from the man controlling it and tried to locate the correct emotional response to what I was hearing. I couldn't find one. There were too many competing for position. What does that mean? I asked. Started that way. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and became composed Fabio again, the distance sliding back into place like a door closing. It means rest, he said. Your next dose is at 6. He walked out before I could push further. But I noticed, as he left, that he didn't take the manifest. He left it in my hands. Like evidence he had decided I was allowed to keep. The visits changed after that night. Not in frequency, he still came after 10, still checked the 4 first, still sat in the chair he had claimed as his. But the quality of the silence between us was different now. Heavier. Charged with the thing neither of us had named yet, the thing that lived in the gap between it started that way and whatever came after. He stopped pretending the visits were medical. He brought work sometimes, documents, calls he stepped outside to take, the quiet machinery of an empire operating on his constant attention. But increasingly he simply sat. Watched me. Asked questions that had nothing to do with my health and everything to do with who I was before the contamination, before the diagnosis, before I became a woman defined entirely by her proximity to dying. He wanted to know about my mother. About the years I'd spent putting myself through night school while working the yards. About the book I'd been reading when the symptoms first started, still on my nightstand at home, bookmark 3 chapters from the end, a life interrupted mid-sentence. Why does any of that matter to you? I asked one evening. He considered the question with his usual unhurried seriousness. Because everyone who comes into my world comes wanting something from it, he said. Power. Money. Protection. They see what they need and they see me as the means to it. He paused. You came wanting to live. That's different. Everyone wants to live. Not everyone is honest enough to admit it's all they want. Something shifted in his expression. You walked into my office with $11,000 and no leverage, and you looked me in the eye and said I'll do anything. You weren't performing. You weren't calculating. He looked at me steadily. You were just true. I didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't sure I wanted one. The staff had noticed. I became aware of it gradually, the way the doctors on his rotation moved carefully around the subject of Mr. DeLuca's involvement in my care, the way the remaining nurse had stopped asking routine questions and started simply completing tasks and leaving. The way a man I didn't recognize had been stationed outside the suite door sometime during the 2nd week, quiet and permanent as furniture. On the 12th night, I heard Fabio in the corridor outside. His voice was low but the edges carried. He was speaking to someone, one of his inner circle, from the deference in the responding tone, and the words reached me in fragments before I could decide whether to stop listening. Moving her to the secondary location is not a conversation we're having. A pause. The other voice, quieter. Sir, the Caruso network has identified. I heard the report. If they know she's here. Then we reinforce here. Flat. Final. The voice of a man closing a door on a discussion. She doesn't move. Are we clear? Silence from the corridor. Then footsteps, his, resuming their approach. He came through the door and found me watching him from the bed with an expression I didn't bother to arrange into anything neutral. They know where I am, I said. Possibly. And your solution is to keep me in the same place. My solution, Fabio said, moving to the 4 stand with the focused calm I had come to recognize as his version of composure under pressure, is to ensure that where you are is the safest place in the city. That's not a guarantee. No, he agreed. It's a commitment. They're different things. He glanced at me sideways. I thought you'd appreciate the distinction. It was the closest thing to a joke he'd offered. I would have smiled under different circumstances. Your counsel thinks I'm a liability, I said. He didn't answer immediately. Finished what he was doing. Then straightened and looked at me with an expression that was difficult to read and impossible to dismiss. My counsel, he said, thinks in terms of leverage and liability. Assets and exposure. A pause. They're not wrong to think that way. It's what I built them to do. His eyes held mine. But they're thinking about the wrong variable. What's the right variable? He looked at me for a long moment. Then, get some sleep, Carmela. The attack came on the 14th night. The storm had been building since afternoon, the kind that made the city feel compressed, tense, like weather with intent. I had been restless all day, unable to settle, some animal instinct registering a pressure change I couldn't articulate. Fabio arrived earlier than usual. 9:15. He didn't explain the change. Checked the 4, took the chair, opened a document on his phone. Ordinary. Controlled. At 9:47, the window on the east side of the suite exploded inward. What happened next arrived in fragments, the way extreme moments always do, the brain refusing to process in sequence what the body has to navigate in real time. Glass. Cold air. The sound of the storm suddenly interior and enormous. Fabio was moving before I had registered the sound, not away, not toward the door, but toward me, the chair overturning behind him, his body covering mine as the second impact hit the wall above the bed and the monitors screamed and somewhere in the suite a door was coming off its hinges. He was speaking, low, rapid, against my hair, "Stay down, don't move, stay with me," and his arm was across my shoulders pressing me flat against the mattress while the room became chaos around us. It lasted less than 2 minutes. It felt like much longer. When the sound stopped, the suite was in ruins. Glass across the floor. One monitor shattered. The 4 stand tipped but the line still intact, still delivering, still keeping me alive by the thinnest margin of luck and the weight of Fabio's body between me and everything that had been flying through the air a moment before. He lifted his head. Checked my face first, my face before anything else, before the room, before the door where his security had appeared, weapon drawn, sweeping the space. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Are you?" He didn't answer immediately. Sat up. And I saw it then, the dark spreading stain across the left shoulder of his jacket, the way his movement favored that side with a careful minimization of a man managing pain without acknowledging it. "Fabio. It's minor. It's bleeding. I'm aware." He was already standing, already issuing instructions to the security team at the door in rapid low Italian, already rebuilding the composure that the last 2 minutes had cracked open. His men were moving through the suite, and a doctor appeared from somewhere, and the controlled machinery of his world reassembled itself around the disaster with a speed that was almost surreal. I sat up in the wrecked bed and watched him redirect every person who approached him toward me instead. Check her line, check her vitals, the shoulder can wait, until I caught his arm as he passed. "Stop," I said. "Let them look at it." He looked down at my hand on his arm. Then at me. Something in his expression was completely unguarded for just a moment. Unfiltered, unmanaged, the look of a man who had spent so long deciding what to show the world that being seen without that decision was almost physically disorienting. "You could have died," I said quietly. "Because of me." "No," he said. His voice was low. Very certain. "Because of them. That's not. Carmela." He covered my hand with his, briefly, just briefly, the warmth of it startling after all these careful weeks of managed distance. "Let the doctors do their work." He meant on me. He still meant on me. "You first," I said. A long pause. His security team watching. His doctor waiting. And then Fabio De Luca, the most controlled man I had ever encountered, looked at me with something that had moved entirely beyond obligation, beyond responsibility, beyond the careful architecture of everything he'd built around this situation. And sat down. And let the doctor treat his shoulder first. It was such a small surrender. It felt like the largest thing I had ever witnessed. Later, much later, after the suite had been swept and secured and the storm had gentled to a low rain, I lay in the repaired quiet and thought about what I had seen in his face in that moment. Not guilt. Not possession. Not the careful calculated interest of a man managing an asset. Something rawer than all of those things. Something that, if I named it honestly, frightened me far more than the gunfire had. Because the gunfire I could survive. What I had seen in Fabio De Luca's eyes when he thought I might be hurt. That was something neither of us was going to walk away from cleanly. And the following morning, I overheard his counsel deliver their ultimatum. "Choose," they said. "Power. Or her." I heard every word. I wasn't supposed to. The meeting was held in the adjoining conference room, the one Fabio used when his world required a physical presence in the building rather than a phone call. The walls were thick. The door was closed. Under normal circumstances, none of it would have reached me. But the attack the night before had left the suite's east partition cracked along the seam where the window frame had buckled, and sound moved through that crack with a quiet indifference of things that don't know they're being overheard. I lay still and I listened. There were 3 of them. I had seen 2 of the voices before, faces in corridors, men who moved through Fabio's orbit with the quiet authority of people whose opinions had weight. The 3rd voice I didn't recognize. Older. More deliberate. The voice of someone who had been in the room for every important decision for a very long time. The Caruso network identified the suite within 72 hours, the older voice said. That's not a coincidence. That's intelligence. Someone in our operation is feeding them her location. A pause. Which means she's not just a liability, a second voice said. She's a vector. She's a civilian with no knowledge of our operations, Fabio said. Flat. Certain. She doesn't need knowledge to be useful to them. She just needs to be important to you. The older voice again. Measured. Not cruel, which made it worse somehow. And she is. That's visible now. To everyone. Silence from Fabio. The Rinaldi family has been waiting for an alliance opportunity for 2 years, the 3rd voice said. Their eldest daughter is educated, discreet, and politically connected. A marriage into that network would close 3 of the exposure points the Caruso situation has opened. A pause. It would also send a message. That you are not compromised. I'm not compromised. You took a bullet for a shipping yard worker. The second voice, carefully neutral. With respect, the perception exists whether you endorse it or not. Another silence. Longer this time. The woman stays until she's medically stable, Fabio said. His voice had changed, not louder, but denser somehow, carrying the particular quality of a man constructing a boundary in real time. After that, we discuss next steps. There's nothing to discuss after that, the older voice said quietly. The discussion is now. While you still have the clarity to make it. I stopped listening. Not because the conversation ended. Because I had heard enough to understand exactly what I needed to do, and continuing to listen would only make it harder. I waited until the voices moved away from the partition. Then I sat up slowly, carefully, with the methodical attention of someone taking inventory of their own body. Legs, functional. Balance, manageable. The dull systemic ache that had defined my existence for 3 weeks was present but diminished. The serum was working. I was not cured. But I was stable enough. Stable enough for what I was about to do. I removed the 4-line myself. It took longer than it should have. My hands were steadier than I expected, but the junction point required attention, and I had to breathe through the brief sharp discomfort of the removal and apply pressure with the edge of the sheet until it stopped bleeding. Small and clinical and completely without drama, which felt appropriate. I dressed in the clothes that had been laundered and returned to the suite wardrobe. My own clothes, ordinary and worn, nothing that belonged to his world. I put on my shoes. I picked up nothing else because there was nothing else to pick up. I did not write a note. Everything I needed to say I would say in person, because I was not the kind of woman who disappeared without explanation, and I was not going to start now. The guard outside the suite door looked at me with undisguised alarm. Ms. Carmela, you can't. I'm not asking for permission, I said. Not unkindly. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. He reached for his earpiece. Do whatever you need to do, I said, and walked toward the elevator. My legs held. That surprised me slightly. I had run the calculation in my head and accounted for the possibility that they wouldn't, that I would make it 3 steps into the corridor before my body registered its objection, and I would have to revise the entire plan. But they held, and the elevator came, and I descended 14 floors with my hand pressed flat against the wall for balance, and my eyes fixed on the floor indicator, and my mind very carefully not thinking about what the 4 removal meant for my timeline. I knew what it meant. I had made the calculation before I took the line out. The lobby was marble and glass and the particular hushed efficiency of a building that conducted important business and knew better than to look like it. A few people. Security at the perimeter. The city visible through the front doors, gray and rain-washed and indifferent, the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business on the other side of the glass. I made it to the center of the lobby before my legs delivered their verdict. Not a collapse, nothing that dramatic. Just a sudden persuasive heaviness, a communication from my body that it had cooperated as far as it was willing to, and further negotiation would be required. I found a pillar and put my back against it and breathed and focused on staying vertical. I was still focusing when I heard his footsteps. I knew them by now. The particular cadence and weight of them, the way they moved with purpose but never urgency, because urgency implied that events were outpacing him and nothing in Fabio De Luca's world was permitted to outpace him. He stopped in front of me. I looked up. His expression was, I had no word for it. Not the composed mask. Not the unguarded crack I'd seen the night before. Something between them, something new, that looked like a man arriving at a moment he had anticipated and finding it worse than the anticipation. His shoulder was bandaged under the suit jacket. I could see the slight stiffness in how he held that side. You removed your own four, he said. Yes. Without medical supervision. Correctly, as it happens. His jaw tightened fractionally. Carmela. I heard them, I said. Simply. No accusation in it. This morning. Through the partition crack. All of it. A pause. Something moved through his expression, not guilt, not calculation. Something that looked briefly, like a man realizing a conversation he had been intending to control had already begun without him. Then you know the situation, he said carefully. I know that staying here is costing you more than you're telling me. I kept my voice steady. It required effort. I know your counsel is right that I'm a vector, not because of anything I've done but because of what I mean to you. Whatever that is. I paused. And I know that if I stay, they will use me to dismantle everything you've built. Let me worry about what they use. No. The word came out with a firmness that surprised both of us. You have spent 2 weeks worrying about keeping me alive. The least I can do is worry about keeping you intact. I pushed off the pillar, stabilized, faced him fully. I won't be the weakness they use to destroy you, Fabio. I won't be that. So I'm leaving. And you're going to let me. The lobby was very quiet. He looked at me for a long moment, that complete, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered, the look that had been cataloguing me since the first night in his office and had never quite stopped. And the cure? He asked. His voice was careful. Giving nothing. I'll manage. You have 11 days of stability without the next dose. After that. I know what happens after that. Then you know you're choosing to die slowly in the name of protecting my empire. Something cracked at the edge of his composure. Not much. Enough. That's not noble, Carmela. That's wasteful. It's a choice, I said. My choice. Which is something you've been preventing me from having since the night I walked into your office. The silence between us stretched. Outside, rain moved across the city's glass face. Inside the lobby, the ordinary machinery of the building continued around us, a phone ringing somewhere, footsteps crossing the far end of the floor, the indifferent continuation of a world that didn't know or care what was being decided in its center. Fabio reached into his jacket. He produced a case. Flat steel, the size of a small briefcase, and he held it out to me with both hands, the bandaged shoulder taking the weight without visible complaint, his eyes on my face with an expression I had no previous reference for and no adequate language to describe. I looked at the case. Then at him. Open it, he said quietly. I did. Vials. Rows of them, carefully secured, each one labeled in the precise notation of whatever laboratory had synthesized the compound. I counted them without meaning to, the reflex of a woman who had spent 3 weeks measuring her survival in doses. Full treatment. Complete course. Every stage, in my hands, at once. That's, my voice failed briefly. I rebuilt it. That's all of it. All of it, he confirmed. No conditions. No stages. His voice was very controlled. Too controlled, the particular quality of restraint applied to something that is threatening to exceed it. No contracts. No leverage. You walk out of here cured, Carmela. However long it takes to complete the course, whatever you do after, wherever you go. I stared at the case. And if I never see you again, he said, quieter now, I'll survive. The words cost him something. I could hear it, the slight roughness beneath the control, the weight of a man saying something he had decided to mean completely even though it was destroying him to mean it. He was giving me back my life. No conditions attached. For the first time since I'd walked into his office with $11,000 and nothing left to lose, Fabio De Luca had surrendered something. Not money. Not territory. Not the tactical concessions of a man managing his assets. Power. The one currency that had defined every transaction of his existence. He turned away. The gesture was so small and so enormous at the same time, a man removing himself from the sight line of a decision he had decided he wasn't allowed to influence. His back to me. The lobby between us. The front doors 20 feet ahead with the gray city beyond them and freedom and health and a life completely untouched by darkness waiting on the other side. I looked at the case in my hands. I looked at his back. I thought about the 4-line he had adjusted himself. The chair he had moved from the corner. The manifest he had left in my hands because he had decided I was allowed to the truth. The way he had covered my body with his when the window exploded inward and spoken into my hair, "Stay with me," not as an instruction but as a plea. I thought about a man who had kept me alive with measured doses because curing me meant losing me, and how that was wrong, genuinely wrong, a wrongness I had not excused and would not excuse. And how it was also, underneath all its wrongness, the most honest thing anyone had ever done in my presence. He hadn't pretended. He hadn't hidden. He had looked at me across every evening of the past 2 weeks and told me the truth about exactly what he was doing and why, and trusted me to hold it, and that trust, given by a man who trusted nothing and no one, was worth more than I knew how to calculate. My footsteps echoed in the marble lobby. He heard them. I saw his shoulders shift slightly, the involuntary response of a man bracing. The footsteps didn't go toward the door. I stopped behind him. He went very still. I pressed the case back into his hands. He turned slowly, like a man afraid of what he might find. Like a man who had spent a lifetime facing down enemies without flinching and had discovered, at the most inconvenient possible moment, that hope was the one thing he didn't know how to stand up to. He looked at the case in his hands. Then at me. "Carmela. I don't want to survive without you either," I said. The lobby, the rain, the city, the empire, the council, the rival family, the war quietly assembling itself around us, all of it receded to the edges of the moment. He stared at me. "You're choosing me," he said. "Not a question. Like a man testing whether a thing is real by saying it aloud. I'm choosing the man who would rather lose his empire than lose me." I reached into the case and lifted one vial. The glass caught the lobby light. "But we're doing this my way now." Something moved through his expression, surprise first, then something deeper, something that rearranged the whole architecture of his face. "My way means you cure me completely," I said. "Tonight. Full dose, full course, no stages, no conditions." I held his gaze. "And tomorrow, we face your council together. Not me hiding in a suite while you manage the fallout. Together." He looked at me for a long moment. The ruthless, composed, completely controlled man who owned half the city's ports and all its secrets looked at the shipping yard worker who had walked into his office with $11,000 and nothing left to lose. And smiled. Slow. Dangerous. And completely undone. "Carmela," he murmured, his voice dropping to something low and private that belonged only to this moment. "You have absolutely no idea what you just agreed to." "No," I said. "But I'm choosing it anyway." Outside, the storm was finally breaking. Light was beginning to move through the clouds in long pale shafts, the kind that make a city look briefly like something that could be redeemed. Inside the lobby of the De Luca Tower, Fabio closed his hand around mine, around the vial, around my fingers, careful and certain and nothing like leverage, and for the first time in 14 days, the thing between us had a name. Not transaction. Not obligation. Not the careful architecture of control and dependency he had built around my survival. Something freely chosen. On both sides. "Then let's go back upstairs," he said quietly. "And do this properly." We were halfway to the elevator when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Something in his face changed, subtle, the way weather changes at altitude before it reaches the ground. "What is it?" I asked. He looked at me. Then back at the screen. "The Caruso network," he said. His voice had shifted back into that other register, not cold, but precise. Operational. The voice of a man stepping back into his world. "They've made a move." "What kind of move?" A pause. He turned the phone toward me so I could see the message. I read it once. Then again. The lobby felt suddenly very different than it had 30 seconds ago. Because the move the Caruso network had made wasn't against Fabio's ports or his council or his alliances. It was against me. The message was 4 words. We have what's yours. No location. No demand. No timeline. Just those 4 words and a photograph attached beneath them, dark grainy, taken from a distance but clear enough. A chair. Zip ties. A woman's wrist with a hospital identification band still attached. My wrist. Except I was standing in the lobby holding the phone. It took me 3 full seconds to understand what I was looking at. That's not me, I said. No. Fabio's voice had gone completely flat. The smile from 30 seconds ago was so thoroughly gone it felt like it had never existed. It's not. He was already dialing. The call connected in 1 ring, someone who had been waiting, which meant someone had been monitoring, which meant the situation was already further along than the 4-word message implied. The conversation was brief and in Italian, and I caught enough of it to understand that whatever had just happened had not happened in the last few minutes. This had been building. This had been constructed carefully, with patience, by people who understood exactly which lever to pull to move Fabio De Luca. They had pulled the right one. Talk to me, I said when he ended the call. He looked at me. The composed mask was in place, but underneath it something was running very fast. I could see it in the slight tension along his jaw, the quality of stillness that isn't calm but is calm's more dangerous cousin. They took someone from the medical facility, he said. One of the nurses from your rotation. Same build. Same approximate coloring. A pause. They knew enough about your care to replicate the detail. Someone on the inside. Yes. Your counsel suspected a leak. My counsel was right. His jaw tightened. Which means they've had eyes inside this building long enough to know what you look like, what ward you're on, what your identification band looks like. He looked at me steadily. They took the wrong woman. But they don't know that yet. I understood what he wasn't saying. When they find out, they'll move quickly. He was already turning toward the security desk, already issuing instructions in the low rapid way that meant the machinery of his world was shifting into a different gear. Which means we move faster. Fabio. I caught his arm. He stopped. That woman, the nurse, she's there because of me. She's there because of them. That's not. I know. His voice dropped. He turned back to me fully, and for just a moment the operational precision receded enough to let the man through. I know. And I will bring her home. His eyes held mine. But right now I need you to go back upstairs with Marco, and I need you to stay there, and I need you to trust me. I'm not going back upstairs. Carmela. She's there because they think she's me, I said. Which means the moment they discover she isn't, she becomes worthless to them. And people who are worthless to the Caruso network don't. I stopped. Made myself finish the sentence. They need to believe they have what they came for. For as long as possible. He stared at me. You're not suggesting. I'm suggesting that I go with you. I held his gaze. Not to the front. Not anywhere near the exchange. But close enough that if they need confirmation, if they need to see me, or hear my voice, or believe the situation is what they want it to be, you have that option. Absolutely not. You said we face your world together. I said that before someone took a hostage. You said that 11 minutes ago, and the principle hasn't changed. I kept my voice level. I'm not asking to be in the room. I'm asking to be close enough to be useful. There's a difference. The lobby had stilled around us. His security team, 4 of them now, materialized from various positions in the building, waited at a careful distance, watching Fabio with the particular quality of attention that means waiting for the word. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that I couldn't fully read, frustration and calculation, and something underneath both of those things that was neither. You stay in the vehicle, he said finally. At all times. Non-negotiable. Agreed. If I tell you to leave, you leave. Immediately. With Marco. No argument. Agreed. And when this is over, he said, his voice dropping to something low and private that cut straight through the operational tone, you finish the full course of treatment. Tonight. No further negotiations on that point. Agreed, I said again. He held my gaze a moment longer, then turned to his team. Let's go. The port district at night was a different city entirely. Not the glass and steel of the financial district, not the managed grandeur of the residential towers where Fabio's world conducted its visible business. This was older infrastructure, concrete and rust and the smell of salt water and diesel, warehouses stretching along the waterfront in long dark rows, their loading doors closed against the rain. I had worked adjacent to this world for 3.5 years. I knew the yards, the shift patterns, the particular exhausted camaraderie of people whose work happened in the hours when the city wasn't watching. I knew what this district looked like in daylight. At night, in the back of an armored vehicle with Fabio's security team moving silently through their preparations around me, it looked like the kind of place where decisions became permanent. Marco, the lieutenant who had become my unofficial guardian in the building, a quiet man in his 40s who communicated primarily through eyebrow movements, sat beside me in the vehicle and said nothing. He was good at nothing. It was more reassuring than conversation would have been. Through the tinted window, I watched Fabio outside. He was speaking with 2 of his men, crouched over something on the hood of the lead vehicle, a map or a schematic, I couldn't see clearly. His injured shoulder didn't slow him. The bandaging under his jacket was invisible from this distance, but I knew it was there, knew the graze had been worse than he'd minimized, knew he had slept approximately 3 hours in the past 48. He didn't look like a man running on 3 hours and a fresh wound. He looked like a man in his element. That was its own kind of frightening, not because it was monstrous but because it wasn't. Because the composed, dangerous intelligence he brought to bear on this situation was the same quality of attention he brought to adjusting my foreline, to listening when I talked about the book on my nightstand, to sitting in the corner chair and letting the silence mean something. He was the same person doing all of those things. I was still working out what to do with that. The call came at 11:40. Fabio took it on speaker, low enough that only his inner team could hear. I watched through the window as his expression shifted, something arriving in it that hadn't been there before. He came to the vehicle, opened the door, looked at me. They know, he said. My stomach dropped. She told them. She didn't have to. They sent a secondary confirmation request, something only you would know. Details of your medical treatment. Specific dates. His jaw was tight. She couldn't answer. Is she alive? For now. He paused. They want to trade. Me alone, at the warehouse at the end of the eastern dock. 1 hour. His eyes held mine. And they want confirmation that you're with me. The silence in the vehicle was absolute. It's a trap, Marco said quietly from beside me. Obviously, Fabio replied, without looking away from me. You're not going alone, I said. I'm not going alone. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one. My team will be in position before I walk through the door. Snipers on the roofline, 2 men inside through the service entrance, the rest covering the perimeter. He paused. But I need them to believe I'm alone. Which means I walk in first. And me. You stay in the vehicle. 100 meters back. He held my gaze. But the window stays down. If they need to hear your voice, just your voice, Marco brings the phone to you. I nodded. He looked at me for a moment longer than the operational situation required. Carmela. I know, I said. I know. Come back. Something shifted in his expression. Brief and unguarded and then composed again. That, he said quietly, is the plan. The warehouse was enormous and dark and smelled of salt water and machine oil, and the particular atmosphere of a space that had been emptied of its ordinary purpose to serve an extraordinary one. I knew this because 20 minutes after Fabio walked through the loading door, Marco handed me an earpiece. He said you'd want to hear, Marco said simply. I put it in. The Caruso representative's name was never spoken. He didn't introduce himself. His voice came through the earpiece with the flat effect of a man conducting business he found neither exciting nor objectionable, purely transactional, which somehow made it worse. The nurse was alive. I could hear her breathing in the background, controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing fear with the focused intention of survival. She'll be released when you confirm the terms, the voice said. Name them, Fabio replied. A pause. The woman. Carmela Russo. Handed to us by the end of the week. No security detail. No notification to your council. Another pause. And you step back from the Eastern Dock territory. Permanently. Silence from Fabio. The Dock territory is negotiable, he said. His voice was completely even. She isn't. Then we have a problem. We have several, Fabio agreed. The primary one being that you've made a tactical error. Have I? You took a hostage to leverage me. A pause. That implies you believe I can be leveraged. Which implies you've misunderstood the situation. The situation, the voice said, is that I have a gun aimed at your head and another aimed at the woman in the chair. That seems clear enough. It does, Fabio said. Which is why I'm going to give you an alternative. I'm listening. Walk away tonight. Release her. Leave the Eastern Dock territory. And I'll consider the debt settled. A long silence. Then something that might have been a laugh. You're not in a position to offer terms. I'm always in a position to offer terms, Fabio said. And his voice had shifted, not louder, not threatening, just quieter in the particular way that meant he had moved past negotiation into something else entirely. The question is whether you're in a position to refuse them. A sound, movement, shuffling, the repositioning of people in a space. Then a new voice. Closer to the audio pickup. Younger. Angrier. You think your snipers aren't visible? You think we didn't sweep the roof line? I think, Fabio said, still at that same quiet register, that you swept for the positions I wanted you to find. A pause. Kill him, the younger voice said. 3 things happened nearly simultaneously. The sound of a weapon being raised. Fabio's voice, sharp, clear, 2 words, move. Now. And then the warehouse erupted. It lasted 4 minutes. In the vehicle 100 meters back, I heard it in fragments through the earpiece, controlled chaos in audio form, the sounds of a space being rapidly reorganized by force, voices overlapping, Marco's hand on my arm keeping me in my seat when every instinct I had was oriented toward the door. Then silence. Then Fabio's voice through the earpiece, steady and unhurried. Secure. Get the nurse to medical. And someone tell Marco to bring the car forward. I let out a breath I had been holding for 4 minutes. Marco was already moving. The loading dock was lit by the vehicle headlights when we pulled up, the warehouse doors standing open, Fabio's team moving through the space with the efficient purposefulness of aftermath. The nurse, young, dark-haired, still zip-tied to the chair which had been carried outside into the air, was being attended to by one of Fabio's medical staff, a blanket around her shoulders, her breathing audible and steady. Alive. I got out of the vehicle before Marco could stop me. Fabio was standing at the edge of the dock, his back to me, looking out over the dark water of the port. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking in the way they sometimes do after a long storm, reluctantly, in pieces, revealing a sky that had been there all along waiting for the weather to finish. I walked to him. He heard my footsteps and turned before I reached him. His jacket was torn at the left sleeve. There was a cut along his jaw, shallow, the kind that looks dramatic and means nothing. His bandaged shoulder was held with slightly more care than before, which meant it had been aggravated and he was minimizing it, and we would argue about that later. He looked at me. I looked at him. You moved the snipers, I said. I moved some of them. Something in his expression. Standard misdirection. You show them 3, you hide 2. They find the 3 and feel intelligent. And the ones they found? We're watching them find the others. Almost a smile. It's not complicated. It sounds complicated. Most things that work are simpler than they appear. He paused. Are you all right? I'm fine. I was in a car. I looked at his jaw. You're not fine. It's superficial. Your shoulder. Manageable. Fabio. Carmela. The way he said my name, it had changed over the past 2 weeks, moving from the formal careful enunciation of the first night to something softer and more private, something that belonged to a register he didn't use with anyone else. I'm standing. The nurse is safe. The Caruso network has been significantly restructured in the last 4 minutes. Restructured. Their primary operational team is currently being escorted to a location where they will have considerable time to reconsider their strategic priorities. A pause. The leadership will receive a message tomorrow. Clear enough that repetition shouldn't be necessary. I looked at him for a moment. And your counsel? I asked. The ultimatum they delivered this morning, power or me. That hasn't changed because of tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Behind us, the activity of the dock continued, his team working, the nurse being settled into a vehicle, the machinery of resolution turning over. No, he said. It hasn't changed. Then we still have to face it. Yes. Together, I said. Like I said. He looked at me across the dock, the broken clouds shifting above us, the port lights laying long reflections across the water. The cut on his jaw. The carefully managed shoulder. The torn sleeve of a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. The man who had kept me alive in measured doses, because losing me was something his architecture hadn't included a contingency for. Together, he agreed quietly. Something settled between us at that word. Not a resolution. The council was still waiting, the empire was still at stake, the world we were about to walk back into together was still the world it had always been, complex and dangerous and making no allowances for what either of us needed. But chosen. Clearly, fully, on both sides. He held out his hand. Not a command. Not a transaction. An offer. I took it. We drove back through the city as the last of the storm cleared. The streets were wet and reflective, every light doubled in the puddles, the city working its way back toward its ordinary self after the weather. In the back of the vehicle, Fabio's hand stayed around mine. He didn't speak. Neither did I. There was nothing that needed saying in words that hadn't already been said in the lobby, in the dock, in the accumulated weight of 2 weeks of careful doses and corner chairs and truths left on tables. But somewhere on the bridge over the Eastern Waterway, in the quiet between the end of one thing and the beginning of another, I thought about the council waiting in the morning. The ultimatum that hadn't changed. The empire balanced on a question about what mattered most. And I thought about the fact that I had pressed the case back into his hands in a lobby. And he had held mine on a dock. And whatever came next, whatever the council decided, whatever the cost, whatever the shape of the world we were building between his empire and my ordinary life, we were going to walk into it with our eyes open. Both of us. Together. The vehicle moved through the wet streets. The city lights blurred and steadied. And somewhere in the building ahead of us, a full case of antiviral serum waited to be administered, not as leverage, not as stages, not as the careful metered architecture of a man managing his fear of loss. Just as what it had always been. A cure. Given freely. The council meeting was called for 9 in the morning. Fabio scheduled it himself, which was unusual, his assistant told me quietly while preparing the conference room, because Mr. De Luca typically allowed his council to set their own agenda and then arrive to manage whatever they'd built. Scheduling it himself meant something. The council would know that. They would arrive already recalibrated, already uncertain, which was precisely the point. I learned this while sitting at the kitchen table of his private residence on the building's upper floor, a space I hadn't seen before, separate from the clinical suite, ordinary in the way that powerful people's private spaces sometimes are, as though the humanity has to go somewhere and this is where he put it. Dark wood. Good coffee. A window facing east where the morning light was coming in clean and new after the storm. My arm was bandaged where the fall had been. My body felt the absence of the line, not dramatically, just the low persistent awareness of a system running on its reserves, counting down toward the next dose with the quiet urgency of a clock you can't stop hearing once you've noticed it. Fabio sat across from me. He had changed, fresh suit, the torn jacket gone, the cut on his jaw cleaned and small in the morning light. His shoulder he was managing with the careful economy of movement of someone who has decided pain is an administrative matter to be handled efficiently and then set aside. He was reading through documents. Had been since 6. I watched him and thought about the woman I had been 3 weeks ago, the woman crossing streets to avoid his motorcade, the woman with a clean record and a quiet life and a book 3 chapters from the end on her nightstand. She felt very far away. Not gone. Just, further back in the sequence of myself than she used to be. You should eat something, he said without looking up. You should sleep. I slept. 2 hours isn't sleep. It's a long blink. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He turned a page. Eat something, Carmela. I ate something. We sat in the morning quiet of his kitchen, and I thought about the council waiting to assemble downstairs, and I thought about the nurse being discharged for medical, and I thought about a glass vial catching lobby light and a man turning away so he wouldn't watch me choose. Tell me what to expect, I said. He looked up. From the council, I clarified. I'm not walking into that room without understanding the terrain. He considered me for a moment. Then he set down the document. 3 permanent members, he said. Aldo, the older voice you heard through the partition. He's been with this organization for 30 years. He thinks in decades. His objections to you are strategic, not personal, which makes them harder to dismiss and easier to address. A pause. Renato is more reactive. He'll follow Aldo's lead once Aldo moves. Donato is the wild card. He's ambitious, he wants my position eventually, and he's been watching this situation for an opportunity. Donato is the danger. Donato is manageable. His eyes held mine. The danger is the perception. What they believe the situation signals to our allies and our enemies. That's what we're addressing this morning. And how do we address it? He was quiet for a moment. By being exactly what we are, he said. Not what the situation made us. What we chose to be. He paused. You standing in that room tells them something they can't get from my words alone. That this wasn't weakness. That it wasn't obsession compromising judgment. Something in his expression. That I chose someone with the clarity and the courage to choose me back under the worst possible circumstances. That's not a liability. That's the opposite of one. I looked at him across the kitchen table in the clean morning light. You've thought about this, I said. I've thought about very little else for 2 weeks. And if they don't see it that way? He picked up his document again. Then they'll learn to. The conference room was on the 12th floor. It was designed for authority, long table, dark glass, the city spread out below the windows like a map of everything the organization had built and intended to keep. 3 men were already seated when we arrived. They stood when Fabio entered, reflex, deep-grooved habit, and then processed in the space of approximately 2 seconds, the fact that I had entered behind him and was not stopping at the doorway. Aldo was as I had imagined from his voice. 70s, silver-haired, the particular stillness of a man who had seen enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. He looked at me with an assessment that was thorough and unhurried and entirely without hostility, which was somehow more unsettling than hostility would have been. Renato was younger, 50s, with the careful neutrality of a man waiting to see which way the situation moved before committing his expression to anything. Donato was not what I expected. Late 40s, well-dressed, with an open face that would have read as friendly in any other context. He smiled when I entered. It was a very good smile. I didn't trust it at all. Fabio pulled out the chair to his right and looked at me. I sat down. He sat at the head of the table. The room settled. Last night, Fabio began, without preamble, the Caruso network executed a hostage operation against this organization. They targeted a member of our medical staff. They believed they were targeting Carmela. He paused. They were wrong on multiple levels. The operation has been neutralized. Their primary team is in custody. The leadership has been sent a communication that I expect will conclude the matter. Silence from the council. The leak in our operation, he continued, has been identified. It was a lower-level placement in the medical rotation, planted 6 weeks ago, before the current situation developed. He's been removed. A pause. That vulnerability existed before Carmela arrived here. It would have been exploited regardless. Aldo's eyes moved briefly to me. Then back to Fabio. The Rinaldi alliance, Donato said. Pleasant tone. Careful placement. The conversation from yesterday morning, that hasn't changed. No, Fabio agreed. It hasn't. The opportunity is not an opportunity I'm taking. No heat in it. Just the flat certainty of a door that isn't going to open. The Rinaldi alliance can be structured through other terms. I'll have a proposal on that by the end of the week. Donato's pleasant expression held. The perception issue is what we're addressing right now. Fabio looked around the table. I want to be clear about something. The past 3 weeks have been characterized internally, and I understand why, as a personal distraction compromising operational judgment. I'm telling you that characterization is wrong. A pause. The Caruso network moved against us last night because they believed I could be leveraged through her. They were operating on the same misreading you've been operating on. And what's the correct reading? Aldo asked. Quiet. Genuinely curious. That I made a decision, Fabio said. Clearly, with full information, understanding the costs. He looked at Aldo steadily. Decisions made clearly are not weaknesses. They're demonstrations of judgment. Which is the only thing that has ever actually held this organization together. The room was quiet. Aldo looked at me. You were a shipping yard worker, he said. Not unkind. Just precise. Yes, I said. You have no connection to this world. I didn't, I said. I do now. That doesn't concern you? I considered the question. It deserved a real answer, not a performed one. It concerns me every day, I said. I won't pretend it doesn't. The world I'm walking into has costs I haven't fully calculated yet and risks I don't entirely understand. I paused. But I walked into it with my eyes open. And the man sitting at the head of this table has never lied to me once. Not about what he is, not about what this is, not about what any of it costs. I met Aldo's gaze. That's a rarer thing than you might think. Silence. Aldo looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Fabio. Something passed between them, the particular communication of two people who have been in enough rooms together to speak without words. Aldo nodded. Once. Small. Meaning something. Renato, who had been a careful neutral throughout, visibly settled, the posture of a man whose decision had been made for him in a direction he found acceptable. Donato's pleasant smile remained exactly where it was. Which told me everything about where his objections had actually lived and where they were going to go next. Not now. But eventually. Something to remember. The Caruso situation, Fabio said, moving forward with the efficiency of a man who had gotten what he came for and saw no reason to linger in the moment. Walk me through the Eastern Dock exposure. I want a full operational review by Thursday. The meeting continued. And I sat at the right hand of the most feared man in the city and listened to his empire talk to itself and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that I understood more of it than I expected to. The cure was administered that afternoon. Not in the clinical suite. That room had been restored after the attack but felt different now, marked by what had happened in it, and neither of us suggested returning there. Instead, Fabio's personal physician came to the residence, to the room with the eastern window and the morning light that had long since moved on to afternoon gold. Full course. Complete dose. No stages. The physician worked quietly and efficiently and left without unnecessary conversation. Fabio sat in the chair across from me, not the clinical corner chair of the suite, just a chair close, the distance between us the ordinary distance of two people in the same room rather than the managed geography of the past 3 weeks. I felt the serum moving through my system differently than the microdoses had, fuller, more complete, the sensation of a process finally being allowed to finish what it started. My body recognizing something it had been waiting for. How long? I asked. Full recovery? 2 to 3 weeks for the organ function to normalize completely. The acute symptoms should resolve within 48 hours. He paused. You'll need follow-up monitoring. Weekly, for the first month. Your doctors. If you'll allow it. I looked at him. That's a genuine question. Not an assumption. Yes, he said. It's a genuine question. Then yes, I said. Your doctors. He nodded. Something in his expression settled. We sat for a while in the quiet of the afternoon. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, continuous, indifferent, the great ordinary machinery of a million lives running on their own tracks. In here, the light moved across the floor in the slow way it does when you're actually watching it instead of passing through a room toward somewhere else. You said something in the lobby, Fabio said eventually. I waited. You said you didn't want to survive without me. He wasn't looking at me, looking at the window, at the light. I want to make sure you understand what that means. In practice. Tell me. It means this world doesn't simplify. He paused. The council this morning, that's not the end of that conversation. Donato will look for leverage. The Caruso situation is neutralized but not finished. There will be other situations. He turned to look at me. I can protect you from most of it. I can't protect you from all of it. And I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. I know, I said. You knew this world from the outside. That's different from. Fabio. I waited until he stopped. I spent 3.5 years working the yards. I filed 2 safety complaints that went nowhere because the people responsible had other priorities. I got poisoned by a shipment that was someone else's war. I held his gaze. I was never as far outside your world as either of us would have liked to believe. He was quiet. I'm not afraid of complicated, I said. I'm afraid of small. Of a life that stays inside the lines I drew before I knew what the lines were costing me. I paused. You blew those lines up entirely. That's terrifying. It's also the most awake I've felt in years. He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his expression did what it had been doing increasingly over the past 2 weeks, moving past the composed mask into the territory of the actual man, the one who adjusted 4 lines and memorized vitals and left evidence in my hands because he had decided I was allowed to the truth. You told me in the lobby that we were doing this your way, he said. I did. I find I have no objection to that. That's new. Yes, he agreed. Something quiet and genuine in it. It is. He confessed the rest of it that evening. Not formally, not a prepared statement, nothing architectural about it. We were standing on the balcony of the residence, the city below us doing its night things, the sky clear for the first time in weeks and full of the particular sharp stars that appear after a long rain has cleaned the air of everything obscuring them. I delayed the treatment, he said. The words came out with the deliberate quality of something that had been held for a while and was being set down carefully. You found the documents. You confronted me. I told you it was because curing you meant losing you. He paused. That was true. It wasn't complete. I waited. I've spent 20 years making decisions about this organization from a position of complete information, he said. I know every variable. I control every outcome I can reach and I plan for the ones I can't. He looked out over the city. You were the first thing in 20 years that I couldn't plan for. Because you couldn't control whether I'd stay. Because I couldn't control how much it mattered if you didn't. A pause. I have built things that cost me. I have made decisions that cost people I cared about. I have calculated those costs and accepted them and moved forward because that's what this work requires. He turned to look at me. And then you walked into my office with $11,000 and nothing left to lose, and you looked at me like I was a problem you intended to solve, and I sat there and thought, if she leaves, something breaks that I don't know how to fix. So you kept me sick, I said. Not an accusation. Just the fact of it, held plainly. So I kept you close, he said. Using the only mechanism I had. A pause. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I did it anyway because the alternative, he stopped. The alternative was trusting that you'd choose to stay. And trust is not something I have a good history with. I looked at him in the dark. At the cut on his jaw, small and healing. At the careful way he held his injured shoulder. At the face of a man who had built an empire on control and calculation, and had been completely undone by a woman with a clean record and a book 3 chapters from the end on her nightstand. You could have cured her all at once, I said quietly. Echoing the confrontation from what felt like a long time ago, the scene in the suite when I'd found the documents. You had the full antidote. Yes. And instead you chose stages. And instead I chose stages. He held my gaze. And then I chose the lobby. And then I chose the dock. He paused. I keep choosing, Carmela. That's what I'm telling you. Every version of what I've done since you walked into my office, including the wrong ones, has been a choice made in the same direction. Toward me. Toward you. The city moved below us. Lights and motion and the ordinary extraordinary business of a million lives. Somewhere in the Eastern Dock District, the Caruso network was reorganizing its understanding of its own situation. Somewhere in the building below us, Donato was recalibrating. The world was doing what it always did, continuing, complicating, making no allowances. I thought about the book on my nightstand. 3 chapters from the end, bookmarks still holding the place where my ordinary life had been interrupted. I thought about the woman who had put it there and the woman standing on this balcony and the distance between them, not a loss but a traversal. A crossing of terrain that had changed what I could see from where I was standing. You didn't trade the cure for my heart, I said. He looked at me. That's what I told you in the lobby. Do you remember? I paused. You traded control. You gave up the thing that was actually costing you something. The certainty. The mechanism. The architecture you'd built around keeping me close. I held his gaze. The cure was never the trade. It was the proof. He was very still. Proof of what? He asked quietly. That you could let go of the wrong thing, I said. And trust that what was real would stay anyway. The silence between us was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling, that has weight and warmth and the particular quality of two people occupying the same moment without any remaining distance in it. Then Fabio De Luca, the most feared man in the city, the man who had built his empire on control and certainty and the careful management of every variable within his reach, reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear with a gentleness so at odds with everything the world knew about him that it almost made me laugh. Almost. Carmela, he said softly, you have absolutely no idea what you just agreed to. You said that in the lobby. It bears repeating. Maybe, I said, but I agreed to it anyway. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled, slow, dangerous, and completely, thoroughly undone. And for the first time in the long complicated weeks since a contaminated shipment had redirected the entire trajectory of my existence, I smiled back without reservation. Below us, the city glittered. Above us, the stars were sharp and clear and entirely indifferent to empires. And on a balcony between them, two people who had found each other in the worst possible way stood in the quiet aftermath of a storm and chose each other in the best possible one. My organ function normalized on a Tuesday. The doctor delivered the news with the professional satisfaction of someone reporting a successful outcome, handed me a follow-up schedule, and left. I sat with it for a moment, the simple clean fact of a body that was going to continue. Not a miracle. Not a transaction. Just medicine administered fully and properly and allowed to do its work. I called in a restoration company for my apartment. Had them deal with the 3 weeks of mail and the wilted plant on the windowsill and the faint institutional smell of a space that had been closed too long. I stood in my kitchen and made coffee and looked at the ordinary objects of my ordinary life and took the measure of how they fit now. They fit differently. Not badly. Just differently, like clothes that still belong to you but remind you that you've changed shape. The book was still on the nightstand. I finished it that evening. Fabio crushed the Caruso network within the month. Not dramatically, no escalation, no public confrontation, nothing that registered in the city's visible life. Just the quiet methodical dismantling of an organization that had made the error of believing they understood his priorities and had been wrong. The Eastern Dock territory was absorbed into his operation. The leak was addressed. The exposure points the Caruso situation had revealed were closed one by one with the patient thoroughness of a man who had learned from what had gotten through. Donato resigned from the council 6 weeks later. Fabio accepted the resignation with the equanimity of a man who had seen it coming and arranged the departure to be clean rather than complicated. A new structure took shape, quieter, more aligned, built around a leadership that had demonstrated its judgment under pressure and invited no further tests of it. Aldo stayed. I liked Aldo, in the end. He thought in decades and he had looked at me across a conference table and asked genuine questions and accepted genuine answers. There was a version of integrity in that, operating inside a world that didn't usually accommodate it. The real transformation though, the one that mattered, the one that no operational review would ever document, was in him. I saw it in the small things first. The way he left his phone face down when we were eating. The way he asked about the book when I finished it, genuinely asked, sat with the answer, offered his own reading of the ending that was different from mine and sparked 40 minutes of conversation that had nothing to do with empires or serum or the price of survival. The way he slept. He had told me early on, during one of the evening visits, that he hadn't slept more than 4 hours consecutively in years. The work. The vigilance. The unrelenting requirement of running an organization that had no tolerance for inattention. 3 weeks after the lobby, 6 weeks after the dock, he slept 8 hours. I know because I was there. And in the morning he looked at the light coming through the eastern window with the expression of a man encountering something he had forgotten was available to him. He didn't control me. He protected me, those are different things, as he had once said about manipulation and deception, and the distinction mattered. I made my own decisions about the world I was moving through. Some of them made him tense. Most of them he accommodated with a grace that I understood was costing him something and honored accordingly. I went back to work. Not the yards, a different role, logistics management, the kind of work that used what I knew about shipping operations without putting me back in the contamination exposure chain. Fabio had no opinion about this that he volunteered. When I told him, he nodded. Good, he said. That's all. You like working, he said simply. You'd be miserable without it. And you're good at it. A pause. Why would I have an opinion beyond that? I looked at him. Because 3 months ago you kept me alive in stages to prevent me from leaving. 3 months ago, he said, I was operating on fear. He met my eyes. I'm not anymore. On the night of the first real cold snap of autumn, the kind that comes in off the water and reminds the city that winter is a real thing that requires preparation, we stood on the balcony again. The city below was the same city. Same lights, same motion, same indifferent continuation of a million lives. The eastern dock was visible from this height, its lights moving in the slow pattern of overnight work, ordinary and ongoing. I used to cross the street when your motorcade passed, I said. He looked at me. Before the diagnosis. Before any of it. I paused. I didn't even know whose it was. I just knew it meant something powerful and probably dangerous, and I moved out of the way. Sensible, he said. Probably. I looked out over the city. I don't think I'll be crossing streets anymore. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. You won't. Not a threat. Not a possession. Just the simple factual statement of a man acknowledging how the terrain had changed and finding, in that change, something he hadn't known he was looking for. I leaned against the railing. Below us, the city moved and glittered and continued in its enormous indifferent way. Tomorrow, I said, you have the Rinaldi meeting. Yes. And the Thursday review. Yes. And Aldo wants to discuss the Northern Territory situation. He does. Something in his voice. You've been reading the briefings. You left them on the kitchen table. I leave them there every morning. I know, I said. A pause. Carmela, he said quietly. I know, I said again. He turned to look at me fully. In the dark, with the city light moving across his face, he looked, not young exactly, not soft, nothing about him was soft, but something that might be the word open. Like a door that had been closed for a long time and had discovered it preferred the other position. You're going to be formidable, he said. Eventually. Eventually. You already are, he corrected. I meant in this specific context. High praise from the most feared man in the city. Accurate observation from the man who watched you remove your own 4-line and walk 14 floors and refused to get back in a vehicle when someone needed to be useful. A pause. Don't let it go to your head. I laughed. It surprised both of us. The ease of it, the realness of it, the way it moved through the cold night air without any of the weight the past months had accumulated around every other moment. He watched me with an expression I had no previous language for and had been slowly building vocabulary toward for weeks. The world, I said when the laughter settled, should probably be afraid. He was quiet for a moment. Then, soft and certain and entirely meaning it. Yes, said Fabio De Luca. It should. Above us, the autumn sky was full of stars. Below us, the empire waited, complicated and ongoing and making no allowances for anything. Between us, in the cold clean air of a night that had come after a long storm, something that had started as a transaction and passed through obsession and crisis and surrender had arrived, finally, at its actual name. Not leverage. Not stages. Not the price of survival. Just this. Freely chosen. On both sides.